Okay, so our last topic here is just finishing up this section on lactation and breastfeeding. So I described how the way that women establish their milk supply in that lactogenesis 2, that period when once their milk comes in, that the main way that women are going to establish a milk supply is by is essentially by nursing and emptying the breast. So the reason why that's really the only way is because of the nature of the control of breastfeeding. So I mentioned that these two hormones, I mentioned earlier that there's two key hormones involved in breastfeeding, prolactin and oxytocin. And they control two different but essential components of breastfeeding. Prolactin controls milk production, milk secretion, and oxytocin controls milk letdown or milk rejection. Excuse me. And I mentioned that the target cells of prolactin are those alveolar cells of the mammary glands that actually produce breast milk, and the target cells of oxytocin are those myoepithelial cells that surround the alveoli and constrict and cause milk to get ejected into the milk duct. So the stimulation for the production of prolactin is suckling. Okay? So the stimulation for the production of prolactin is suckling. When a baby suckles the breast, it takes basically the entire nipple into its mouth and it presses the underside of the nipple, the area around the areola. It presses that against the palate of his mouth. And there's this rhythmic sucking that happens of both the nipple and part of the areola. And this process of suckling, which is a very specific kind of stimulation, stimulates the mechanoreceptors in the nipple, and it acts on cells on in the hypothalamus. So those mechanoreceptors in the nipple send that sensory information up to the brain, and it acts on cells in the hypothalamus that control the release of what's called prolactin releasing factor and prolactin inhibiting factor. So suckling tends to inhibit the release of the inhibiting factor and stimulate the release of prolactin releasing factor. And that prolactin releasing factor gets released from the hypothalamus, acts on the anterior pituitary cells, on those lactotrope cells in the anterior pituitary, and it stimulates the production of prolactin. Prolactin enters the bloodstream, and then it finds those alveolar cells in the breast and stimulates the production of milk secretion. Okay. Now, oxytocin is stimulated also by suckling, okay? But oxytocin is actually stimulated by a lot of other things in addition to suckling. Any kind of nipple manipulation or stretching is going to stimulate oxytocin. Any kind of sort of hand massage of the breast. There are a whole host of what we call conditioned responses that stimulate oxytocin, including things like hearing your baby cry, thinking about your baby, right? So all of these things that you condition your brain to associate with breastfeeding, with suckling and your baby drawing milk out of your breast, all of those things are going to trigger oxytocin release by the hypothalamus. So oxytocin is released at the posterior pituitary, It again travels through the bloodstream and causes contraction of that myoepithelial cell, and it causes milk ejection. Now, just like every system like this, there's a negative feedback. Now, the negative feedback tends to be actually predominantly on prolactin. Right? And it's an interesting form of negative feedback. So if milk is not removed from the breast, right, any amount of milk that stays in the breast actually tends to provide this negative feedback. And there's actually a component of breast milk. Okay, there's a component of breast milk. It's a disaccharide, and we call it the FIL, or the feedback inhibition of lactation. Now this FIL, which again is within the breast milk itself, the negative feedback actually is in the form of reducing the sensitivity of the alveolar cells to prolactin. So as long as there is milk in the breast, that the alveolar cells, or milk in the alveolar cells become less sensitive to prolactin. Okay? And their sensitivity doesn't return until the milk is emptied from the breast. Okay? So this really speaks to why in that lactation amenorrhea method that I mentioned earlier, why no supplementation during breastfeeding is really necessary in order to ensure your prolactin levels are high enough to block fertility. Okay. Now, humans are mammals, right? And which means that we produce milk and we feed our young. Other mammals, including whales and cows, produce milk. And in general, the composition, meaning the various components of that milk of mammals, are fairly similar in terms of containing basically fat, water, and basically other components, including carbohydrates, including lots of electrolytes, and just a whole host of other things. Now, so mammals are also warm-blooded animals, and so they have to maintain their body heat. And so interestingly enough, if you notice here, the fat content of human milk versus cow's milk is fairly comparable, right? 3.5% for cows, 3.3% for people. But whale's milk is a whopping 43% fat. And that's mostly because whales have to produce a lot more body fat in order to insulate themselves and their body heat from the water that they swim in. So the high fat content of the milk of some mammals really reflect the environment in which they live in, and in the environment in which their babies are going to live in as well. Very fascinating. So, you've heard the description, breast is best, right? So human breast milk really differs in some important ways from formula and from cow's milk, which most formula is based on. And also, mature human milk differs in a lot of important ways from colostrum. So remember, colostrum was that milk that you're producing immediately postpartum and also a little bit before delivery. Okay, so just comparing first the colostrum to mature human milk, some of the most important differences is really in, where is it? Right here, is in the antibodies. Okay? So colostrum has a much higher content of antibodies compared to human milk, and certainly compared to cow's milk. Okay? And it's essentially just, it tends to be sort of more yellow in color, tends to be very, very thick, less water content. It tends to have a much higher concentration of electrolytes and certain vitamins. Okay? And human milk differs in a lot of ways to cow's milk. And the differences that have been found it basically supports the fact that human breast milk is a much better food for human babies, as you would imagine, than cow's milk. So lots of advantages of breast milk, of breastfeeding. The fat in human breast milk is much better for absorption. You have less diarrhea and deaths from diarrhea. Okay, so lower chances of diarrhea and deaths from diarrhea. You also have a lower chance of acquiring pathogens that colonize the GI tract when a baby is breastfed. Part of that is because there is what we call passive immunity that's conferred because of the IgA and the antibodies that are present in breast milk. And this is very interesting because basically if mom and baby are exposed to the same diseases in the environment, mom's going to produce antibodies against those bacteria, viruses. That's then going to be passed to baby through the breast milk. Okay, so there's a considerable amount of passive immunity that is conferred to babies during the breastfeeding. Very protective. There's a lot of protective bacteria that we find in breast milk, mainly Bacillus bifidus and Lactobacillus, which colonize the infant's gut and helps protect it from pathogenic bacteria. We also see white blood cells in breast milk that help the baby. We see very short-chain fatty acids that are better for absorption, enzymes that kill pathogenic bacterial cell walls. We see lots of hormones and growth factors like CCK and gastrin and prolactin and epidermal growth factor, prostaglandins, etc. Right? And all of these things go into the baby's gut, and it really helps enhance growth and development of their GI tract. We also have things like B12 binding factor that binds to B12 and it enhances absorption of B12 by the baby. And other antimicrobial protectors like fibronectin, mucinins, oligosaccharides. There's a huge, it's actually a huge area of study to actually study all of the different components of breast milk that confer a benefit to the baby. You also, of course, get bonding and attachment through breastfeeding. There's sort of a calming and sedating effect on actually mom and baby through breastfeeding. You get lower rates of hyperinsulinemia, obesity, diabetes later in life. And there's lots of advantages for mom. It reduces the risk of premenopausal breast and ovarian cancer, postmenopausal osteoporosis, reduces stress in some ways, can increase stress in other ways, thought to decrease the risk of postpartum depression, mainly because of the attachment and bonding issues. But that doesn't mean that women who are breastfeeding can't develop postpartum depression, diabetes, cardiovascular disease. So lots of advantages for both mom and baby. And advantages that are exist beyond just this list on this page. And then finally, a woman who is breastfeeding actually has a energetic and nutritional requirement that, believe it or not, is above and beyond what she had during her pregnancy. Okay? So producing breast milk actually is a greater energetic cost than pregnancy. So if we look at sort of the energetic cost in terms of the additional calories that are thought to be needed above the level that was taken in during pregnancy, and also these nutrients and vitamins and minerals, we see that in terms of the calorie requirements, there's an estimated increase of about 500 calories a day above pregnancy level needed for breastfeeding. There's 25 more grams of protein and a considerable amount of increase in many of these nutrients and vitamins and minerals above, above pregnant levels. Okay. So women who are breastfeeding, you could think about this, women who are breastfeeding are producing a considerable volume of breast milk a day that may actually represent up to 500 to 1,000 calories a day for this baby. So in order for mom to produce all of those extra calories, there's a high metabolic and nutritional cost of that.